It's great to be here, and I have a lot of hopefully interesting things to share with you today. And I think I'll start by giving you a little bit of an idea of how it is that a high school teacher ends up here on stage talking about the evolution of consciousness, and based on a book that I wrote. But I think that the short answer to that is curiosity. All right, so for most of my life I've been very curious, and I think that is an entirely normal thing, that all children are curious, and unfortunately many children lose that from either the parenting that's a bit heavy-handed or school. As you know, curious kids are a problem, right? Don't ask all these questions, and then heavy religion and all these kinds of things tend to kill our curiosity. I imagine most of you here are pretty much curious because you came to this talk. But my parents also raised me with a lot of freedom and allowed me to explore a lot of things, and I grew up with the Rector sets and chemistry sets and things like that. And my schooling in the Boulder Valley schools was also quite good. I had a lot of great science teachers that really got me turned on to science. And when I finished high school, I thought that what I might like to study was psychology, because I was very interested in consciousness, whatever that is. And but when I got to CU, I happened into a physics course taught by the infamous Al Bartlett, and I would say that changed my life. And I became a physics teacher. I can blame that entirely on Al, a phenomenal human being who became a mentor and friend. And so I spent most of my career teaching physics and working with kids, and really trying to instill curiosity and the love of learning. And throughout all this, I was always interested in some of the big questions that are around. So today we're going to be taking on some of those big questions, like how did we get here, particularly in this mess today that we're in? What can we blame that on? How can we make sense of what's going on today? Is this the decline of civilization? Are humans going to go extinct? Or is there a bright future for us? This is a question that I'm very interested in. Is there intelligent life elsewhere, or is Earth the only place that this has happened, where we'd have these people sitting in an auditorium with all this technology? And what about the future? Where are we headed? Do we have a bright future? And finally, the most important one, I think, for all of us is how much influence can we have on the course, the future course? Is there anything we can do to help ensure a bright future? So let's start from where we are today. And as we all know, there's a huge number of problems that we're facing, many, many challenges. What you see filling this oval is by no means all of them. And if you think about back to the 60s or something like that, those times, it really doesn't seem like there were that many problems. We had a huge fear of nuclear war. We didn't really have enough awareness of something like racism to think of it as a problem. We're just beginning to become aware of air pollution and water pollution, but that was about it. But today, it just seems like it's a cascading chain of more and more problems. And I don't know how many of these we can solve as new ones appear. For every one of these, there's probably a nonprofit, and I bet some of you might work in a nonprofit, either volunteer or donate or actually work on staff, or maybe you founded a nonprofit to address some of these problems. So we have this problem-solving approach, and that we've got to narrow our focus to a single problem, like climate change. So we have the climate change organizations. We have heroic efforts going on. We have governments, to the extent that they're functional, trying to pass regulations and laws. We have private sector efforts, massive efforts, but it just doesn't seem like this approach is working. So I'd like to suggest that we might think of this a little bit differently. We might think of these more as symptoms. And we might think about, is there something that really is at the root of all of these problems? And if we could get at that, we might really have a shot at changing the situation. What if these really are symptoms, and if we could get to the disease, then we might really have a shot at turning things around. Instead of just putting out wildfires, what if we can get to the source of why are there so many fires? So as you might guess, I have a suggestion on what this might be, so we'll come back to that. But to answer that, let's really take a big look at evolution, because evolution really is a big piece of this. And we tend to think of evolution from biology class, the evolution of life and the theory of Darwin and all this, and that's just a piece of it. But now with recent advances in science, we have a much bigger idea about what evolution means, and that we can talk about the evolution of the universe going all the way back 13.8 billion years. So this is the time frame that we should now think of, and we really can't comprehend what that means, or that the Earth is almost exactly 1/3 that age, that the Earth didn't come along till about 2/3 of the way through the life of the universe. And if we can think of these as each of these thirds as one day, and then look at this third day and expand that out a bit. So if we imagine the lifetime of the Earth, the lifetime of our planet, to be one day starting at midnight, the origin of life is around 4:15 a.m. in the morning. It took quite a while for the Earth to cool down and the conditions, the oceans to form and the conditions to be right. It was not until about 10 p.m. in the evening that the first land animals appear. The dinosaurs went extinct 20 minutes before midnight. That was 65 million years ago. Now, where do we fit into that? Well, it's going to be hard to squeeze that in that tiny little space there. But the first Homo sapiens, now dating to about 300,000 years ago, came along 6 minutes before midnight. And then civilization, the much vaunted civilization and the conventional history that we study in school, fills only the last 1/10 of a second of these 3 days, the age of the universe. Now, if you think about how we learn history in school, it's pretty much the history of civilization. And, like everything before that is prehistoric, maybe cavemen and Neanderthals, and nothing really much happening. But we really never look at this big story. And it's only recently that we have all the pieces from science to put together this story of big evolution. So let's look a little bit at this big evolutionary story. Let's start with the astrophysics, the evolution of the universe, sometimes called cosmic evolution. And so we have a lot of evidence now that the universe began about 13.8 billion years ago in a massive explosion, starting from a point that was virtually infinitely hot and dense and small, and that it's been expanding ever since. And the story of evolution, the evolution of the universe, all of evolution is really about complexity. Evolution is really about increasing complexity. So when the universe was about 1 second old, current theories hold that protons appeared, protons formed, and this is also the same as hydrogen. So at 1 second, the universe is very simple, just filled with hydrogen. And the hydrogen, because of gravity, begins to clump into stars. And so the first stars began to shine. And they, again, were very simple, not like the stars we have today, because they were almost entirely hydrogen. And early in the life of the universe, the stars, for some reason, clumped up into these magnificent structures called galaxies. And so galaxies are one of the fundamental structures of the universe. We live in a galaxy. There's still a lot of mysteries around galaxies and why they are about the size they are and contain the number of stars they contain. But in those spiral arms of galaxies, there's prolific star formation going on. And so throughout the evolution of the universe, stars, starting from these very simple ones, go through their life, and the very large ones die in massive explosions called a supernova. And throughout this time, they're manufacturing heavier and heavier elements through the process of nuclear fusion. And so as time has gone on until finally we get to what we might call the mature stars, like the sun. As I said, it took 2/3 of the way through the life of the universe to get a star that has all of the elements, all 92 elements, and a planetary system around it. So of course we understand the solar system, and we know that we have this magnificent, nearly perfect circular orbits going around our star. But until about 1990, no one knew if any of the other stars had planetary systems. It was strongly suspected, but very difficult to observe. So starting about 1990, with very clever techniques using gravitational pulls and the fact that when planets pass in front of a star, the light intensity drops a little bit, we've now begun to study exoplanets and confirm that, yes, there are planets around other stars. And we've cataloged something like 5,000 stars with exoplanets. And so really what we can conclude is that all stars have planets. There's almost no way they could not have stuff going around them because of gravity. And so all those stars in the sky are really star systems. Now the question of whether there's intelligent life, the first part of the answer is very simple. We have no evidence that there is. We've never observed any evidence that there is life other than on Earth. But there's more and more suspicion that there probably is intelligent life because there are so many stars. And to give you an idea of how many stars there are in the universe, if we start with our own galaxy, we can do a nice calculation in high school physics class that shows that there's about 100 billion stars in our galaxy. That's 10 to the 11th stars. And as we've looked out at the universe to very great distances, we know there's about that same number of galaxies, 10 to the 11th, 100 billion galaxies. So there's about 10 to the 22 stars in the universe. Now, how big is that? Well, the best way to understand that is try to imagine your favorite beach and try to imagine how many grains of sand are on that beach. Incomprehensible, really. But now, try to imagine all the beaches of the earth, how many grains of sand that would be. People have estimated that. There's ways you can get a rough idea. And different people keep coming up with around, 10 to the 18th. So the number of stars in the universe is thousands of times bigger than the total number of grains of sand on all the beaches of the earth. So that's a lot of stars. So even if 1 in a million or 1 in a billion of those stars had an Earth-like planet, that leaves a very, very large number of planets that could be suitable for life. So it seems very likely. That's just speculation. Now, one of those planets, as we know, was very special. It was just the right distance from our star. Many other factors came together to make the Earth suitable for life. We have no idea how life got started, still one of the greatest mysteries of all. But eventually we know that once it got started, this evolutionary process unfolded, and we represent that by this kind of evolutionary tree. This is a very kind of simplified, popularized version of an evolutionary tree. The biologists have much more sophisticated ones. But the overall pattern of complexity, increasing complexity we see, until finally, way up there at the tips of one of the branches, we have us. The human lineage, arguably, because of our brain, the most complex form of life. In fact, many people will make the statement that the human brain is the most complex thing known in the universe. So something kind of special about that. So let's now dig into the evolution, human evolution, what happened during our journey, the story of humans. And our story, really, we might start with this guy. This is not a real photograph. It rather looks like one because he lived about 3 or 4 million years ago. This guy is Australopithecus, and this is a photo of a very realistic model that was created by a famous artist named John Gurche. I think it's at the Smithsonian, but it's quite haunting. You have the sense of intelligence there. Australopithecus, of which there were actually at least 7 varieties, this all happened in Africa. In fact, most of our story is in Africa. But what was striking about what happened about 3 million years ago is that along with the skeletal remains, which is how we study skeleton and teeth of these ancestors of ours, there appear something that had never been seen on the Earth before, stone tools. And this photo is of a very old stone tool. It might be 2 or 3 million years old. You can see how worn it is. That's a sign that it's authentic. And it's a chopping tool. And these creatures, and we really don't know who the original makers of these tools were, but they were able to source the right materials and develop the techniques that are quite sophisticated to create these so that there's a cutting edge there. And it's not just that one individual did this, it began to spread. They taught each other. They weren't using language, they couldn't explain it. They taught each other through a type of mimicry that I'll tell you more about in a bit. So this was really the turning point where our lineage really split off from all other life forms on the Earth. From now on, it's a story of tools, and we call this the birth of culture. Because the culture really is the knowledge that is spread, that these creatures, whatever they may be called, were teaching each other. And this spread throughout Africa and eventually spread up into Eurasia and into Europe. And so this is, we will call the birth of culture. So the story that paleoanthropologists have put together of human evolution really starts about 3 million years ago. And we don't know whether the first tool users should be called Australopithecus africanus, which is the scientific name, or Homo habilis. Conventional wisdom calls the first tool users Homo habilis, but it's a very murky time. It's very difficult to have much evidence of what was going on. But we have very clear trail of skeletal remains that show that by about 2 million years ago, a new species emerged in Africa called Homo erectus. And this was a very successful creature that eventually, actually very soon, left Africa. Some of them stayed in Africa and continued their evolution there. Others left Africa, moved up into Eurasia, and eventually all over into Southeast Asia, and eventually went extinct maybe 50,000 years ago, pretty recently, actually. But the ones that stayed in Africa eventually turned into a much more sophisticated, much larger brain, much more human-like species called Homo heidelbergensis. And this lineage, which really is called the Homo lineage, that's really the name of our lineage. This would be the first point that I might call this human. Homo habilis really wasn't human, at least, and it's just kind of words, it's semantics. Homo habilis was 5 feet tall, weighed 100 pounds, and looked more like an ape, really. But Homo heidelbergensis was getting to be very much more human-like and developing many more sophisticated behaviors and intelligence. Now, this species, some of them stayed in Africa, and some of them made their way into Europe, and they became the Neanderthals, as well as we now know some other species, kind of parallel species to the Neanderthals. The ones that stayed in Africa then, by about 300,000 years ago, took on the form that we call Homo sapiens. So that would be the emergence of our own species. So this is the picture that we have, the conventional wisdom, and paleoanthropologists argue and debate and try to invent new species, and it's a very contentious science, but this is kind of the mainstream view of it. The other piece of this that's very important for the evolution of consciousness is what happened with the brain during this 2 or 3 million years. The brain continued steadily to grow, and we know this from the size of the volume of the skull. We don't know what was going on inside that brain, but we know what the size of the brain was. Modern humans average about 1,400 cc's. Interestingly, the Neanderthals actually had a larger brain. They were a little larger in stature. And at some points when we coexisted, we're probably the superior species. But something happened with humans, I'll tell you a little more about in a bit, that changed that relationship. So it's more than just brain size, it's what's going on inside the brain. All right, so when paleoanthropologists talk about the evolution of culture, they're talking about, instead of the skeletal remains, bones and teeth, the tools, the tool culture. So stone tools, the good thing about them is they're very durable. They last very well. So we have a lot more evidence in the form of stone tools, and we can see through time them becoming more and more looking like they're human-made until, I mean, by the time you get to something like this, I mean, can you imagine the craftsmanship and the skill it would take to create that? But this was a couple million years it took, incomprehensibly long, for the tools to go through this progression. But right about 60,000 years ago, something happened that was very dramatic. It's so dramatic, it's been called the Great Leap. This was a phrase coined by Jared Diamond. But all of a sudden, instead of these sort of handheld tools, generally called hand axes, which for 2 million years was the state of the art, all of a sudden now we get sewing needles and musical instruments and harpoons and fish hooks. Something, we don't know what, but there was an explosion in human capacities that apparently the Neanderthals did not experience. And so this is where the humans really parted ways with the Neanderthals. And from that time on, tool technology, tool culture just continued to explode. We get the cave paintings that we see in the caves in Europe, and figurines, and finally full-blown civilization with the pyramids and the temples. And then from there, where has it gone today? What is our culture? You know, we have literature and art and science and TikTok, and you know, it's just exploded. So this is really the story of humans, is the story of culture. Now, what is it that is underlying that culture? Culture is something that appears in the world. Somehow it's out there, but it's something inside of humans that is producing culture. And so that is what we mean by consciousness. And we now know that there's this intrinsic relationship, this positive feedback cycle between culture and consciousness. And that as goes one, so goes the other. So culture is sort of the exterior manifestation. Consciousness is the interior that we really can't see and measure. But to understand what's going on with humans, we really need to turn to consciousness. So what is consciousness? And I'll just say from the beginning that we are now leaving mainstream science, because there are some parts of science, such as neuroscience, that is trying to understand the nature of consciousness, but it can't be measured by meters or measuring sticks. It can't really even be defined. But I will offer this simple definition, that consciousness is an experience. It is the experience that we are all having of being a human being, of being awake and alive. And that's, now what produces that is the great mystery, the so-called hard problem that they talk about in philosophy. All right, well, the way in which I'm going to use the term consciousness now is referring to a big catch-all, a big collection of many different things. So first of all of the things that we might interpret as and associate with intelligence in a conventional sense, all the thinking and rationality and logic and mathematical ability, musical ability, all these kind of what we conventionally sort of call intelligence. Perception, how we see the world. We have a very good understanding of how the senses work. For example, the eyes, which are our primary sense. We know that photons of light come in and get focused on a screen in the back of the eye that has little detectors that respond to the energy of those photons, depending on if it's green or red. And that creates a little voltage pulse that travels down the optic nerve to a certain part of the brain. That much is pretty simple. But now what happens in the brain after that, completely incomprehensible. So it creates this reality that we experience, or I like to call it the movie, because more and more we're understanding that the brain really does create this movie, and we just watch it. And there's lots of things that might get put into that movie according to our fears and past experiences. So this is very much of how we see the world, or I'm going to refer to this as our worldview, is part of this perception and brain process. Emotion, of course, is a piece of our experience. Emotions have more of an ancient brain sort of origin, reptilian brain kind of thing, fight or flight, anger, pleasure, these kinds of things. The experience of being embodied is part of consciousness. It's not just in our head. We are here as a body. And one of the newer things, at least in science, that there's growing evidence for is that the heart is actually part of consciousness. That the heart, we've now discovered, is full of neurons, something like 70% neurons. It's not just a muscle that pumps. It's got neurons just like the brain, and it's connected to the brain by the vagus nerve. And we even know that there's more information that goes from the heart to the brain than from the brain to the heart. So though we may tend to think of the brain as being in charge, it's the commander of the body and tells us to breathe and run and all these things, there's actually growing evidence that the heart knows first and often directs the brain. And so we'll come back to the importance of the heart as a part of consciousness. Now, right in the middle of all this, there is an 800-pound gorilla that's often been denied or misinterpreted or confused. And that is that there must be an experiencer we call the self. That consciousness ultimately is an experience. So the self is maybe the greatest mystery of all of this. What is the nature of the self? And from Buddhism through all the great wisdom traditions, people and the philosophers have struggled with this, and I read more than anything else sort of a denial of the self. The self is not real. It's just an illusion. There's a whole book called The Illusion of the Self. And back in the 1800s, the anatomists, which were doing dissections, would take a brain and look for the seat of the self. And of course, they never found it. So it is something, but it's a piece of this whole package that I am referring to as consciousness. Now, consciousness is evolving, and that means all of these things are evolving. The movie that we see is changing. It may not be the same as what the people 100,000 years ago were seeing. So let's keep that in mind, and the self also is evolving. All right, so let's now get to the theory that I put forward in my book of the evolution of consciousness, the framework for this. And my book really is an integration of the work of two, I would like to call them heroes of mine, Jean Gebser and Merlin Donald. And they each, about 40 or 50 years apart, came up with a very similar framework for the evolution of consciousness. Gebser was working in Europe. He's hard to categorize. He's often called a cultural philosopher, but that doesn't really do him justice. He worked with Jung. He hung out with Picasso and Heisenberg. He was very much connected with the cutting-edge thought in Europe in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And his book, The Ever-Present Origin, was published in about 1956 in German. But he's highly unknown in the United States. It was not even translated into English until 1985. Merlin Donald, on the other hand, is a mainstream scientist, scholar, academic, Canadian, cognitive psychologist, neuroscientist, anthropologist. And I discovered each of them independently and was just so struck by how similar their two theories were. And so I really wanted to get in touch with Merlin Donald and ask him the question, have you ever heard of Gebser? I finally worked up the courage to do that, and surprisingly, he emailed me right back, and we developed a fairly long communication over maybe a year. But the answer to the question was very simple, as he had no idea about Gebser's theory. And so it was very striking that from very different places they came up with a similar framework. So my book, called Emerging World In, is largely a synthesis of the work of these two people, plus some more recent knowledge we have about paleoanthropology. And it takes this same period of time, the 3 million year story of the Homo lineage, and quite simply, there's a framework of 4 major stages in the development of consciousness. And so these are stages in time, in evolution, and they also relate to structures of consciousness, not necessarily brain structures. But for example, that time 60,000 years ago when there was this phenomenal leap, and we know that the size of the brain didn't change, but some kind of rewiring, something went on in there that caused this transformation of consciousness, really. As to the future, Gebser had a lot to say about that. In fact, much of his book is a description of what he saw as this future structure of consciousness that was emerging. He called it the integral consciousness, and clear back in 1932 had this premonition really based in what was going on in Europe at that time. The Nazis were coming to power. He had experienced World War I. He kind of saw the collapse of civilization and the emergence of this new thing that he called the integral consciousness. Merlin Donald, on the other hand, being the scientist that he is, would not speculate about the future. When I tried to engage him in that, what did you think about Gebser's integral consciousness? He didn't really want to go there. All right, well, just to kind of flesh out each of these structures and what they're about, the mimetic structure is associated with tool making. In fact, and it was really Merlin Donald that was able to figure out what the mimetic capability was. Gebser couldn't do much with this very early first few million years because when he was working in the 40s and 50s, we didn't know anything about paleoanthropology. We didn't even know that our origins were in Africa. So tool making, according to Merlin Donald, was because the people at this time had developed a new type of memory system called semantic memory that worked in conjunction with the preceding memory structures called procedural and episodic memory that's characteristic of birds and mammals. But with this new memory system, it gave them an ability that he calls mimesis. And that comes from the word mime or mimicry. And so this is exactly what tool making was about, is one person going through the bodily motions and teaching another person this very sophisticated, the techniques and how to source it. And so this is the thing that no other animal has ever achieved. And we know from chimps and bonobos in captivity that they'll pick up a rock and use it as a tool. So you'll often hear about different animals that are tool users. But there's a difference between tool using and tool making. And that is the thing that really distinguished us. So tools, of course, are our legacy. I mean, tools, what is a cell phone but another tool? So that's been our story. So this was a knowledge base that was growing, the knowledge of how to make tools and probably other things that they were sharing. And they started to live in social groups that we would now call the family. And there aren't other animals that really live as families together. Then the magical structure was something that Gebser really figured out by studying the work of Margaret Mead and some of the other cultural anthropologists that were studying the Pacific Island cultures that have virtually disappeared now. But back in the 30s, they got a glimpse of the magical culture and the magical consciousness. And probably we can associate that in the archaeological record with the Homo heidelbergensis about 1 million years ago. And so this was heavily steeped in ritual and ceremony, demons, nature spirits, voodoo, all of these shamanism, all of these kind of things that we might picture from, scenes from some Disney movie of the natives at night dancing and drumming and chanting around a fire. And they were trying to construct the meaning of what the volcano, why was that happening in the volcano gods. And this was their structure of meaning, was through ritual. And people started to live in larger social groups that are often called clans or troops. And living in social groups is very demanding on the brain, and so as the brain was growing, the capability to handle more and more relationships was also growing. The Great Leap then, the so-called this phenomenal, dramatic transformation that happened around 60,000 years ago, is often said to be the origin of modern humans. So if we had to say, when was modern humanity born, that would be the date that probably most scientists would choose. From this time on, humans left Africa and very rapidly spread over all the habitable continents and became the geologic force that we still are today. This is where we see all these extinctions of large mammals happening, and this is also thought to be around the time that spoken language emerged, which was a huge development. Not just making grunting sounds, but actually having words. And so it's called the mythical culture and the mythical consciousness because this is the oral traditions of storytelling and myth. So this was how people found meaning, was through stories. According to our cognitive scientist, Merlin Donald, there was a new memory system that emerged at this time that is called autobiographic memory. And we all have that. And as it sounds, it simply means that we have the memory of a lifetime. We have an autobiography. This is something that probably my dog can't do, or previous hominids. And that means an awareness of birth and death. And so we now move into this obsession with death and the afterlife. And certainly stories were told to try to explain all of these mysteries. And this mythical obsession with the afterlife goes right into the Egyptian civilization much later. And the Egyptians were, the pharaohs, built the pyramids for their afterlife. This is also, because of this autobiographic memory, said to be the origin of self-awareness, the awareness of yourself. These are sort of conventional claims. According to Gebser, and Gebser fleshed out all of these things in detail, but he described the mythical consciousness as being very dreamlike. Now this is very interesting if you think about dreams, because dreams are very weird in that anything can happen. You can be here one moment and suddenly you're in New York City. There doesn't have to be an explanation. So he called this pre-causal. The idea of causality, like if we say, if you suddenly appeared in New York, there's got to be an explanation. You must have gotten on a plane and flown there. That's causality. The world makes sense. But the reality set or the movie of the mythical people was probably much more like a dream. I personally speculate that perhaps at this time there really wasn't a clear distinction between the dream state and the waking state, that they just kind of overlapped. And that what happened later in our modern consciousness is that very clear distinction between dreaming and waking. And people again started living in even larger social groups, which are often called tribes. Well, the most important of all these to understand is our current regime of culture and consciousness that I have chosen to call the material. Gebser and Donald, Gebser called it the mental and Donald called it the theoretic, in referring to things that happened really a few thousand years later, leading to science. But the very striking thing in the archaeological record that happens about 5,000 years ago is the appearance of civilization. And there was nothing like this before, where we have these huge pyramids and temples and palaces and walled cities. And before this, there was early what are called proto-cities, large collections of people, but they all just lived in the same kinds of dwellings and none of this monumental architecture. This is also the advent of written language, and so the idea of the material. Not only do we see buildings and indoor spaces, humans creating this artificial world, but knowledge for the first time becomes permanent. Instead of being passed along through stories or rituals or mime, It is permanently recorded in clay tablets, and eventually papyrus, and paper, and digital storage. The other very striking thing that happens with the advent of civilization is centralized power structures. That is to say, emperors, high priests, kings. There's no evidence of this before this time. These were also almost entirely male. This is when the public sphere really became reserved for the male, and the females stayed home in the domestic sphere. Not long before this, the so-called Neolithic societies seemed to be largely matriarchal. So this was really the onset of patriarchy. The social hierarchy is evidenced in the pyramids themselves. If you think about how did they get constructed, slaves, that was the power source of the societies, and who's in charge of all that? There's somebody directing all that. And so we get everything. We have the royalty at the top and the royal family and the stratified societies right down to the slaves. This is really when we begin the war on nature, when we start paving over everything, to put it figuratively. And this is for the first time when evidence of organized warfare appears. Armaments and shields and fortified cities, evidence of organized military, not there in the archaeological record before this. Probably people had skirmishes and there was violence, but not this massive organized, conquest and empire sort of regime. And later, much later, of course, just in the last 400 years, we get the emergence of science and the pure rationality and logic and the scientific method, and the incredible things that science has produced. This is when probably our reality set, moves into the full three-dimensional space and linear time. Gebser spends a lot of time talking about the experience of time throughout these different stages. In the mythical, they were certainly aware of the seasons, and Stonehenge and these kind of things were astronomical observatories. And currently, our view of the world, our reality, really, I like to describe as objects in space. We tend to think of the world as filled with objects that we can push around. That's what building a pyramid really amounts to, is pushing around a bunch of big blocks of stone. And we even treat people as objects. So we have this very objectified view of the world. And of course, the very important social structure that emerged 5,000 years ago and still persists today is the nation. Speaking of today, then I want to point out that this list should look very familiar, because it's pretty much where we are today. And though we may think of ourselves as so sophisticated and modern with all of our gadgets, many of these things have really not changed. We still have these centralized power structures. We still have war. We still have this objectified view of the world. All right, well, if we just look at those colored boxes along the bottom, you see a progression there in the social sphere, from families to clans to tribes to nations. What would be next if we now think of the future? There's really only one possible place we can go, one larger social structure, and that would be the planet. And so this, to me, is the signpost of the future that we're moving into of culture and consciousness is about planetary consciousness. So I like this word, the planetary consciousness, to refer to what is emerging, the world that is emerging. All right, well, though it's nice to depict this in linear fashion as it developed over time, a better way really to depict the evolution of consciousness is in this circular fashion, where time is sort of going from the center out. And that each of these new structures, when the magical structure emerged, it didn't displace the mimetic. It still includes it. It encloses it and includes it. And the mythical, it's not that people left the magical structure behind. It's still there. It's still there in all of us. That it's the mythical structure became the highest governing structure, as Merlin Donald likes to say, or the predominant structure of consciousness. And the material consciousness that the world predominantly today is in, and most of us are largely in that still, transcends but includes all the previous structures. Story, think about how important stories still are for us. That's our mythical consciousness. The magical might perhaps be our enchantment with nature that we certainly need to recover, but that the magic of nature. And the mimetic, the game of charades is really mimetic. We can convey meaning without using words at all. So the idea of the planetary then is it's not replacing, it's not better than, but it's enclosing. And this is the thing that Gebser referred to as the integral consciousness. And I like the name integral because it implies integrating all this. So what Gebser is saying is that where we are right now in our development as humans is to put all of this together. And to some extent, it might mean recovering some of these things that have been lost, that this material veneer has really perhaps pushed away and dulled and prevented us from experiencing these other structures of consciousness. There are many other people that have talked about this same idea of a new consciousness emerging for humans. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the well-known Jesuit priest and paleoanthropologist, had a whole evolution of consciousness theory that he used the term complexity consciousness. And he talked about the noosphere being a new kind of an enveloping consciousness becoming global or planetary. Abraham Maslow, very late in his life, recognized that his highest level in his pyramid of human needs that he called self-actualization was actually needed something beyond that, and he called it self-transcendence. It's something little known about Maslow's theory, and the way he described self-transcendence is very similar to Gebser and Teilhard. Robert Keegan is still alive, a very famous Harvard developmental psychologist, and he has a scheme of it's sort of self-development, and his highest level of development that he says people are moving into, he just calls stage 5 or layer 5. We have many other developmental psychologists you may have heard of that have all worked in this area of the evolution of consciousness. Some of them are dealing with, like we may think of Piaget as talking about child development. A very interesting thing is that these stages here, the mimetic, magical, etc., can be mapped directly into Piaget's developmental theories that, young infants are in a mimetic consciousness. The first thing they do is try to track and follow and imitate. And then they become very magical. In the game of peekaboo, they think they can disappear by, covering up their eyes. And then the story becomes important. And then the logic and rationality, the abstract, as Piaget called it. So this scheme, you can think of this as a map of your own consciousness. You can think of it as a map of where humanity is. You can think of it as a map of an individual evolving through a lifetime. There's also very popular interpretations of all this to well-known people that have really programs they're selling, Don Beck and Ken Wilber, all based on the evolution of consciousness. All right, so this is not a new idea. It's not a far-right idea. Yes, it's not in mainstream science, but there's a lot of people talking about the same thing. Another interesting thing that's come up that a lot of writers have talked about is they've estimated that 1% of the population of humans now has substantially acquired this planetary or integral or stage 5 consciousness. Now, 1% doesn't sound like much, but that's 80 million people. I suspect a lot of people in this room would be in that 1%. And in a minute, I'll flesh out what we're talking about, and I hope you recognize a lot of these things. Other people have estimated as high as 2 or 3 or 4 or 5%. It's a silly estimate because there's no way to really measure it. We don't have measures of the planetary consciousness. And certainly none of these transitions are sudden things like I woke up one day, it's kind of like the enlightenment of the Buddha, like boom, like, oh, now I'm in the planetary consciousness. These are gradual transitions and things that we have to step way back from to really see. So that 1% number, let's come back to that. It's significant, I think. So in my work, in my research for this book, I really attempted to pull together all the descriptions that I could find of what this new consciousness or the planetary consciousness is like. And some of this comes out of Buddhism. It turns out the Buddhists were pretty much scholars of consciousness a good 1,000 years ago or so, and many other wisdom traditions, and all of the things that these scholars are saying. And so I like to call these markers. They're just sort of signposts or look-fors, if you like. And so two of them, which really kind of come together, connectedness and wholeness. So the planetary consciousness is an experience of the connectedness of the world. And this is not a new idea. Virtually all indigenous cultures have this idea of everything is connected. And this comes out of Buddhism. And in a more sort of intellectual sense, it comes out of ecology, which around in the 1960s really became mainstream. And this idea that all of life in the planet is all interconnected. And we have food chains and ecosystems and all these. This is connectedness. So it's not necessarily a mysterious thing. Getting a little more mysterious, it turns out that the physicists kind of stumbled into this about 100 years ago. The world of Newtonian physics is basically about clunky objects interacting like balls on a pool table. And in the early 1900s, they began to see that this is really not how things at the atomic level work. And they developed through mathematics an entirely new type of physics called quantum physics, quantum mechanics. And one of the things that comes out of that apparently bothered Einstein a lot, is called entanglement. And even today, in the recent Nobel Prize was just given for people who had demonstrated entanglement. But it's a very strange idea that these things we're talking about are little particles like electrons, that they can be separated through empty space, and somehow they're still connected. That if you tweak this one responds. And we don't know exactly how that works or why that works, but it's very well verified. So there's more and more suspicion that entanglement may be happening throughout living systems. The human body really is a massively entangled system. It's not a collection of parts. It's not a machine. So we're transitioning from this machine-like view of the world. The world is a big machine just made of parts. And really, when I learned life science in 7th grade, it was about the systems, and as though these were different, like the spark plugs and the clutch. And now a car you can take apart entirely and put it back together and still get the same car. But living things, no. So this connectedness also leads to wholeness, because when you connect everything up, now you've got a whole thing. And so this is the notion now of seeing our place in the world in this connected whole, this whole planetary level of seeing things. And connectedness, stretching things a little further, people have suggested that people are connected, that we are one whole human family, in fact. Even though we can't see the wires or the strings that connect us, that there is a wholeness to humanity, and we are connected with nature. And so this is the new view of the world. This is a radically different view of the world. Instead of being a collection of objects that just collide and you can push around with no consequences, everything you do is connected to everything else. Wholeness also is something that has to do with paradox. And we have many paradoxes, things that seem to be mutually exclusive. For example, a classic one is the individual versus the collective. So either you can be the strong individual, which, Americans are rather focused on this individualism, the Ayn Rand, the self-made man, the man has all the answers, he's in charge, versus the collective, which you might think more like ants or bees as being the collective. Well, do we think that's a good thing? The good of the whole, service to the community. Don't I have to give up my individualism? Isn't it an either or? But in this mentality of wholeness and connectedness, we can resolve that paradox and say, you can still be the strong individual in community, in the collective. And so there are many things like that resolve paradox. Ego transcendence is a big theme. And some back to this idea of the self and the evolution of the self. So I like to use the term ego to refer to the stage of selfhood, we might say, that is predominant today. And this idea of you've got to go out and sell yourself and promote yourself and take charge and be powerful. And this is all very masculine, of course. But then, women's liberation comes along and says, well, we want women to be like that now. And I'm not sure that's really what we need to do. So now there's a new way to be in the world where it can be more about, instead of being powerful, to empower others. And there's a lot of new research and theories in leadership about the servant leader, leaders who empower others, they make others look good. And so it's a whole new way of being in the world. It's not that we're transcending the self, we're transcending the egoic self. The meta-perspective is just a term I like, but Gebser talked a lot about this as he fleshed this out. He called it the aperspectival aspect of consciousness. A meaning without. And so he described this as being without a single perspective. Now, what is a single perspective? Well, it's my perspective. It's your perspective. I mean, how else can we see the world except through my eyes? And what Gebser is saying, and this really isn't that radical of an idea, is that you can get into someone else's shoes. You can shift your perspective. You can recognize your own perspective and then get out of it. And this is so important today as we have all this polarization and tension between people with different perspectives. So according to Gebser, Picasso, who he knew, some of these paintings or drawings that Picasso made that show a face with both a side view and a front view, according to Gebser, he was trying to depict this aperspectival, this that you can have simultaneously hold more than one perspective. And you can see that emerging in the world. Then the evolutionary view to understand that humans are not a static, finished project, that we are still evolving, and it's part of this evolution from the Big Bang on, the story that we went through earlier today. That we have this, that the world it's a process rather than a static thing. Heart integration, and we talked about the heart as being part of consciousness, and our mainstream culture and consciousness is very head-centered. We got to think about it and figure things out and lay out all the arguments. But there's something called intuition as well. And sometimes maybe you lay out all the logical arguments, but it just doesn't feel right. I hope you've had that experience because it probably means you're more tuned into your heart. So it seems that the heart actually functions as a source of intuition, seat of love, beauty, joy, all these intangible things that are not really head-centered thoughts. And so the idea of integrating this, that we can operate in both spheres. It's not that thinking is bad and logic is bad, but we can also listen to our hearts and often be guided and just know that something just isn't right. That's the wisdom of the heart. And finally, put at the center of all this is a commitment to truth, really. The truth quest. And not that there is one truth, but that we must be committed to pursuing truth. And we know today that the state of truth is very sad. Not just because we have politicians that just can lie routinely, but really what has been called postmodernism, I like to call it the counterculture, what my generation did, starting in the 1960s or so, it's been called deconstruction, was to dismantle the idea that there is universal truth, that we each make our own truth, and it's all relative, and stealing isn't that bad because it's better than killing. So at least I'm not killing. So we've been left in what's been called a moral vacuum. And so a return to the quest for what are the universal truths is important. All right, well, let's return to this question from earlier. What is that something that is really at the root? What is the disease that's really caused all these problems? I think you won't be surprised that I'm going to say it's this material perspective, this belief in a material world. It's just a bunch of objects we can push around with no consequences. The material culture, the material consciousness. And that this is part of an evolving pattern of stages that we've gone through. And there was a time before this, before we were at war with nature. And all signs would suggest that we currently are in the late stages of this material regime after 5,000 years, that it really is not working, that our misunderstanding of the world, our inability to understand the interconnectedness of everything, of all people, all living things in the planetary system, is killing us. Part of Gebser's theory was at the end of each of these stages, towards the end, things kind of start to go south, that structure of consciousness can no longer serve as it did in the past. And so this material worldview perhaps had its place, had its purpose. And a lot of incredible things have happened in the last 5,000 years. But we must recognize that it's ending and there's something new that is emerging that I like to call the planetary worldview. So this, of course, is the evolution of consciousness. And this is really what is going on with humans. It's not that we're getting smarter. It's not that science is getting bigger and better and our technology's fantastic. It's the evolution of consciousness. Now, if you think about the aspects of that planetary consciousness, particularly the connectedness of the world is really the primary feature, it really leads to social justice and harmony with nature. If you understand the interconnectedness, then it matters what happens to other people. It matters that we have systems that oppress certain kinds of people. It matters that we are deforesting the planet and paving it over and dumping plastics. Although it's very easy to think small and to think that when I buy that plastic item and use it and then throw away that plastic, I don't see a problem. And so, again, the planetary is the much bigger perspective of seeing ourselves in the context of a much bigger planetary system. So, the big project, as I like to call it, the matter before us, it's not getting to Mars. It's not how can we bring more artificial intelligence. It's not even the cure for cancer or feeding the hungry. The big project is to do whatever we can to help humanity, to support, encourage, catalyze the evolution of consciousness, to move that 1% of people that understand this, of the people that are committed to social justice and environmental stewardship, that becomes more and more people. That is the big project. So, to support the evolution of consciousness for a just and sustainable world, that is the most important thing that can happen. So we like to talk about the planet movement as more and more humans get on board with this and say, yeah, I'm for that. That makes sense to me. And think of this in the same context that we might think of the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, the women's movements of the 60s and 70s. And there was no one person that brought these about. You can think of Martin Luther King and, you know, critical people. There was no one organization, but it was a collection of gathering of people that said, we are committed to these values. So I would think of the planet movement as really the culmination of all of these movements. Because really the two pillars, social justice and environmental stewardship, that covers everything. So these movements from the 60s, in my opinion, are unfulfilled. They were successful to some extent, but they're still not there. Now the next step is to merge them together into a planetary movement, the planet movement. So some of us in Boulder were thinking along these lines and just said, well, who's going to do this? I guess maybe we should give it a shot. So we've taken on the big project, and we created an organization called the Planet Project. We're very young. We're just 4 people, 4 workers, and 4 advisors. We're developing relationships. And our fundamental strategy is back to this relationship between culture and consciousness. So if we really want to see human consciousness evolve, we can get at it through the gateway of culture, because we can create culture. Culture now is just exploding. It's crazy what's going on. What if we made a concerted effort to create culture that was wholesome, if you like, that spread these ideas of connectedness and wholeness and softening of the ego and heart development and stories that depict men in nurturing roles. And so we haven't even really tried to do anything like this. So that's our key strategy, but we're small, and you know we can't produce full-length movies and things like that. So another thing that we've done is we've looked around the world on the internet and found that there are a lot of people and a lot of organizations doing really good work. So we've collected all of these together into a database that is on our website, and it's searchable by categories if you want to see something related to climate change or indigenous wisdom. So we've got a list of organizations, we've got a list of cultural things, actually movies, books, articles. So that's one way we're trying to bring what we call positive culture into the world. But as we've looked around, we've seen that there are many other people and organizations among this 1%, I suppose, that are trying to do exactly the same thing. They're using different language, different terms, different strategies. Particularly in Europe, I think things are way ahead. And we just started a dialogue with a group in Sweden that's got an incredible network of organizations and people. In Germany, it's very active. And so we're trying to reach out, and because we know we can't do it alone and no one organization can do it alone. And so the dream really is to try to pull all this together, all the people that are working on the big project, and try and get some common languaging and some common strategy and start to put out media on TikTok or Instagram or whatever, full-length movies that is encouraging of the evolution of consciousness. And the call into this is really around this shared vision, which I've really stated in different forms, of the world we want. There's really just 2 boxes we have to tick. Social justice, also sometimes called diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? This is one of the goals of Frasier, one of the foci, and environmental stewardship, or sometimes the word sustainability. That's it. Sounds simple, but it's still a pretty heavy lift. And we're trying to construct a set of core values that we think could be universal to all people, that transcend religion, politics, traditions. You know, what are the basic things we can agree on? All right, so I could tell you a lot more about the Planet Project, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to refer you to, first of all, our website. This is the front page of our website, and there's a menu across the top there, and there's a lot in there. Our databases of positive culture are there, so take a look at that, planetproject.io. There is a handout that we have that has all this information you can find. We have a newsletter that goes out monthly. This is the most recent one. I encourage you to subscribe to that. At the bottom of any page on our website, you'll see what you see there on the right, and there's a button that says subscribe, and you just give your name and email address. So please do that. And we've also created an online platform called the Planet Community, where you can post and comment and connect with people. There's groups that we're forming called circles, kind of discussion groups that we're trying to get some on-the-ground human face-to-face interaction going. And you can get at that also through our website. So I just want to finish with what are the major takeaways. What do I want you to walk away with today? First of all, the idea that evolution is big. It's much bigger than just the evolution of life, and it's still ongoing now. Humans are still evolving. It's not that our physical form is evolving. We've pretty well adapted to the physical environment now, but it's the evolution of consciousness, and it's real. And we can identify major stages through the work of many different people that are now emerging. And it's not important that you know the names of those. Different people are using different names. But very important to recognize our current stage, whatever we may call it, it's a 5,000-year stage that really is producing the destruction of our planetary life support system and a lot of suffering in the world. Right now, it's not a very healthy place. When you look at suicide rates and opioid use, mass shootings, we all know. So it's not sustainable. It is changing. And the good news is that there are many signs of a new perspective on the world, a new way of seeing the world, a new movie that we like to call the planetary, and that it's naturally supports social justice and environmental stewardship. And we have this idea that there are some number of humans that are substantially in this regime, and another 99 to 95% that are not, and that is the big project. And finally, that we have many people around the world working on this project. And there's one right here in Boulder that we call the Planet Project. And whether this project is successful or not will be the most important factor in determining the future of humanity. I'd just like to leave you with a quote from a very wise woman named Barbara Marx Hubbard that kind of sums this up. We are part of a generation that, for the first time in history, is capable of destroying itself as a species or consciously participating in our own evolutionary transformation.